Sarah.
Melissa.
What are we doing today?
We are reading Prep by Curtis Sittenfeld.
Let's do it. Sarah, I would be remiss if I didn't just open this episode by commenting on our matching denim. It's really just going to be something I'm fixating on today when I'm seeing you. But I love it. I'm a huge fan of denim, and without any preparation whatsoever, preparation, little reference to the book there maybe, we both wound up today here in denim. So thank you for inadvertently twinning with me today.
Denim never goes out of style. You could say that it's a classic, it's a staple, which I think is also relevant in terms of the book that we're reading today, because this book is 20 years old.
Oh, that's quite an aged book. Maybe it's on its way to being a classic for sure. And I feel like denim, denim's a bit of a mood too. There's a certain vibe that goes along with just denimness. And I've been hearing this term mood read just more and more. I encountered it, and then I feel like now it's just always popping up for me. What does that expression, mood read, mean to you?
For me, I really feel like mood read is another kind of timeless. We probably are unconscious of the kinds of mood reads that we find ourselves in. But, when you think about it, and I've talked about this before, you look at the different times of year and fall. Are we more likely to maybe read something a little spookier as we're getting into the Halloween season? Obviously, we've got a Christmas read. We're looking for holiday spirit. That's a mood for sure. And then the term beach read is beach read for a reason. They tend to be lighter fare. They tend to be pulpier, maybe a little bit sexier, which, certainly in my book, summer is the sexiest season of them all. So it makes sense to have, a little sexy beach read. So I definitely am a big believer in a mood read, and I feel like it's something that really propels me. And when I even think about this year, because I am feeling kind of good, kind of confident about where I'm at this year, this time this year, I should say, for what I've been able to read, and kind of just the reading roller coaster I've been on, and I'm definitely thinking that mood is encouraging me and propelling me forward in my reading momentum, I guess you could say.
Yeah, I can see that. When I've encountered this term mood read, I wasn't really sure if it meant about the selection of the book. Sometimes we're really strategic about okay, I'm going to finish this book and I really want to read this book, and having this TBR that we're working our way through. So my initial understanding of mood read was just picking something spontaneously, just seeing it and being I'm in the mood to read this, and then reading it. But the more that I'm hearing this term, it feels like it's about just sort of reading a book for a feeling, reading a book for a vibe, as opposed to, say, plot. And call me a traditionalist, but I'm a bit of a sucker for a plot. I do like a plot, but I know that not every book necessarily has or has to have a plot. What are your feelings on this?
It's funny. I am certainly discovering more things and habits and preferences that I really have when it comes to being a reader, and just based on the kinds of books I've found myself being drawn to, and also some conversations. We're always talking about the beauty of reading books is that you get to have these conversations with a book and with others who have read the book. It's a shared experience. And I have really discovered that plot is not the end all be all for me. Plot is not something I need to be able to enjoy a read. I had a very interesting conversation, probably about a month or so ago, with my sister-in-law, and she's an avid reader. In terms of our kind of Venn diagrams of the types of books that we read, they don't overlap a ton, but they do a little bit. And we of course follow each other on Goodreads, which, I'm more and more looking at that as a really good tool to kind of monitor my reading and, find new reads, all of that. But she had read a book and went on Goodreads and saw that I had read and rated that book. And she reached out to me immediately and she was like, I need to talk to you about this book. I have feelings about it. And the conversation that ensued from that was and it was about a book that we've talked about on this podcast. It was Emma Cline's The Guest. I believe that might have been like episode 4
Yeah,
of
and
our
will
first
interject
season.
here in case anyone hasn't listened. That is our top, like that of
Yeah.
all of the episodes we have done. That one has been listened to, downloaded, streamed the most by kind of a long shot compared to any other book we've talked about. So yes, carry on.
It is interesting and I think that maybe this is relevant that the fact that that's a most listened to episode and the kind of conversation I had with my sister-in-law about it, because that book would definitely be a mood ring. There is atmosphere to that book. There is not a lot of plot. And in the conversation that we had, the thing that bugged her the most, that made her have all these feelings about this book, is that there wasn't a plot. And she kind of finished the book and was a little bit mad at it and thinking like, why did I read this? Like, what really happened in this book?
She
And
wanted
my
to take it out
argument,
on you, it sounds like.
yeah, it was a good conversation, and we definitely exchanged some kind of LOLs about it. Although we did ultimately disagree about like our I guess our interpretations of the book. And for me, it was atmospheric enough, it was vibey enough that I really got a lot out of that book. But it didn't. I didn't need like a super compelling, well drawn out plot for me to enjoy it. And I would really encourage people to listen to that episode if you haven't yet, because I feel like this is why could read, should read, must read. This is, something that we do is because we try to be relatively spoiler free with how we talk about the books. But I think even just based on our conversation, and as well as whether or not we feel it's a could, should, or must read, can really kind of give a person the idea of like, I don't know if I would like that book. And even though I might be giving it a certain rating, but I found that to be a really interesting, just like an interesting thought. And then I was thinking about books that I've read and enjoyed, even just this year alone, and really seeing a pattern of not super heavy plot. I mean, one of our more recent episodes where I talked about Our Evenings by Alan Hollinghurst. Look at that. Said that
Nailed
so
it.
well. That wasn't super plot driven. It was very episodic, and it really was all about character rather than plot. And I'm gonna do it again. I do it all the time, and it's either similar to whether or not a book has a plot or not. It's either gonna be endearing or it's gonna be alienating. But I'm gonna fall back again on my pop culture crutch and talk about the White Lotus, which I feel like, God, if you threw a rock at an episode of ours and I didn't mention White Lotus, my goodness, would there even be any episodes? But the White Lotus just finished their third season. It's an HBO show. I absolutely love it. Not necessarily super plot driven. There is plot to it, but it is definitely far more focused on character and mood. And Mike White, who is the creator of the show, he is the writer of the show, he is the director of the show, he is the editor of the show. He is like a one man band. He does all of it. Because normally it's like teams of people, but it's the Mike White show, truly. And he did an interview on the official White Lotus podcast about the show and people's feelings about it as a season, this particular season. And I'm going to give a little quote from him. And it's a bit of an abridged quote. It's a little bit spicy of a quote if you listen to the full thing, which I would recommend listening to that podcast as well as ours. But he says, there was complaining about how there's no plot. Part of me is just like, bro, this is a vibe. I'm edging you. Enjoy the edge. If you don't want to be edged, get out of my bed. Don't be a bossy bottom. And it really spoke to me to the point where I actually sent that to you as soon as I saw it. And I was like, I'm going to send this to anyone who ever complains about there not being enough of a plot in a book that I really love. So that's my long winded way of saying, I don't need plot. Give me some good character. Give me some like really good kind of internal monologues and something that somebody's struggling with. And I'm all about it. So.
Yeah, I can definitely feel myself shifting, right? That like
Yeah.
I'm not looking for plot in a way that I was before. I'm not thinking of it in terms of like absence of plot being a critique or something like that. Like there's definitely more to just the reading experience or the experience of being immersed in something that has nothing to do with plot. But I too now will always default back to that quotation that you so kindly sent me. Thank you.
It's a classic, much like jean jackets
That's right.
and much like, books that are maybe 20 plus years old.
Well, let's get into. I'm hesitant to ask you certainly for a summary because generally speaking, that would involve discussing plot. So I'm going to maybe phrase it a little bit differently for this particular episode. But you and I actually, unexpectedly so, are on like a bit of a kick lately. And that kick is in relation to an author, and the author is Curtis Sittenfeld. And I had not really known much about this particular author. I knew about the book Romantic Comedy, which got a lot of attention. I think it was a Reese Witherspoon book club book. And, it's one of those books like the cover's striking and it shows up in sort of like the Bookstagram feeds rather often. I will admit that I assumed, and wrongfully, that Curtis Sittenfeld was a male writer. That's not true. But I really didn't know that there was much beyond her work than romantic comedy. And then you told me about a collection of short stories that she released this year in February of 2025, so a very new book called Show, Don't Tell. And I knew you were absolutely loving that book because you told me that you were like rationing it for yourself. Like you didn't want to just read it all, even though you were compelled to devour it. You were like restraining yourself because you wanted the experience of reading these stories to last. And the only time I think that I can relate to that is reading or listening to anything by Simon Rich, who also tends to like be more inclined to write short stories. And I have to like restrain myself because I want to just always be listening to them and I want them to always be new. So I can relate to that in relation to Simon Rich's writing as well. So I know that feeling. But you read Show, Don't Tell, and then I read Romantic Comedy, and then you read another book by her, I believe. Am I right?
Well, the next book that I read was Prep.
Okay.
And there was a reason for that. And then I ended up at the same time that I picked Prep up from my local library. Shout out to the Killingly Public Library and our friends Claudette and Kim.
That's right.
But I also picked up another selection of short stories that was called You Think It, I'll Say It.
Right.
So I picked both of those books up at the same time and then read Prep. And then I just finished You Think It, I'll Say It like days ago.
Right. And then as I was kind of like, it was almost like I had blinders on, and then these blinders just kept like broadening because she's also written like, and bestsellers too. Like, I don't know how this person was not more prominently on my radar. But Rodham, which was sort of like a retelling or a reimagining, I guess, of the life of Hillary Rodham Clinton. There was like loads of bestsellers that I had no idea existed. And as you've already referenced, spanning like the last 2 decades. So this person has been like prolifically writing and successfully so, but really you and I were both kind of consuming a lot of it all in a short amount of time, which isn't really common for us to be kind of doing on like a bit of a kick like that. So all of this to say, Prep was definitely nowhere on my radar. I have very little understanding of what it's about, what it deals with. Do you want to, and again, hesitating to use the word summary, but maybe give us a little window into what this book addresses?
I like it. Well, I think that this is a book that you can summarize. It really is the account of a fictional character named Lee Fiora. and her experience attending a prep school in like the late 1980s, early 1990s is when it's set. There's no specific year ever mentioned in the book. So I found myself kind of like trying to figure it out just based on like pop culture references, which is a sweet spot for me anyway. But it really just goes from freshman year, first year, ninth grade, grade nine, all the way through grade 12 or senior year. And it's just her experience. Now, Lee is from South Bend, Indiana. So she's a Midwestern girl, and she's found herself at this prep school. It's called Alt Academy, and it's in Massachusetts. So it's on the East Coast in New England. New England is kind of known for prep schools, at least here in the United States. And, it's a little bit of a fish out of water because while she is certainly, like, I would say solidly a middle class person, she definitely is not someone who would commonly be going to a school like Alt. She is surrounded by people who have very privileged upbringings and backgrounds. I mean, there's a whole group of boys that are referred to as bank boys in the book because all of their fathers work in and around, banking, investment banking in New York City, and are like the wealthiest of the wealthy. And so it's a real internal account of what it felt like for her to go to this school. It deals a lot with identity and the shifting of identity that comes from being this fish out of water, thrust into this environment where you're, trying to figure it out and trying to belong, or at least trying to fit in or blend in. And what I also enjoyed about it is it's told in retrospect. So it's told probably, I'd say, like maybe 10, 15 years after the fact. So it's a recollection. And so there's a lot of her looking back at who she was, decisions that she made, encounters that she had, and kind of reconciling, maybe things that she should have done differently or would have done differently, or things that she learned from. But that's really kind of it in a nutshell. It's four years of this young girl's life, um, and this life changing experience of going to this school.
I feel like, prep schools, private schools, boarding schools are fairly commonly used in books, movies, TV shows. I mean, Harry Potter is probably the most obvious one, I think, that anyone's mind would go to at this point. But even Our Evenings that we talked about in the last Rogers episode is partially set, especially in the early days, in a prep school. I even was thinking about like The Facts of Life, I'm pretty sure was like set in a school. Like there's so many different examples of it. And I get it, right? Like I think that environment, sort of close quarters, kind of like a microcosm, sort of like this, like, I don't know, very tight-knit kind of quarters is a really great kind of setting for a variety of different creative realms. Can you talk a little bit about how that setting of the prep school worked in this case?
Well, I definitely think a prep school as a setting, I mean, this is going to be very morbid, but when we think about Disney movies, and stay with me on this one, a lot of times the parents of whatever protagonist that we're kind of following along on their adventure loses their parents tragically at a very young age, and that's what kind of propels them and thrusts them into this adventure. And in a weird way, a prep school as a setting also does that without you having to have like this tragic loss in the character's life, because you're taking a character at like a very formative age. You think about it, it's really like ages like 13, 14 through say 18, a time when normally you would be under the care and guidance and supervision of an adult. And certainly you are under the care and supervision of an adult at a prep school, but in a weird way, it's like kind of being thrust into this like almost like college dormitory environment. You're left to your own devices a lot, and you have to really navigate socially this environment because you're living in it as well as going to school in it. And so I feel like it is a really effective way of showing a character on a journey in a way. But I think as well, and going back to this idea of Lee, the character is a fish out of water, I think it's also a really great way for young characters to be shown in like kind of that clash between cultures and what that looks like and what that feels like, and to be so immersed in that kind of an experience, it's surrounding you and you trying to really kind of catch up and keep your head above water, you know, to kind of stick with the fish out of water and swimming.
Yeah, and I think
Yeah.
that I'll admit I'm not particularly familiar with like prep school as a concept and certainly not as like a location, but I feel like there is an attempt to make it a very sort of democratized space in the sense of like they typically tend to wear uniforms, right? Like sort of making everyone uniform, as it were. You know, probably their living quarters are relatively, you know, consistent for all the students. They're taking probably similar courses, this type of thing. So the idea is that everyone is participating or benefiting or engaging with this version of education in a very equal way. But I suspect that part of what happens in this book, too, is that it tries to show where those inequalities are, even though there's an attempt to make everyone sort of more uniform.
Certainly. I mean, I think that that kind of uniformity only works to a certain point, and these differences will surface, they will show. And Lee, similar to David in Our Evening, so it is funny that both of these books are set in prep schools, and I just had to talk about them. Um, she is a really observant, um, observant and kind of shrewdly aware character, and I think that that's all, you know, obviously like a survival instinct, and it serves her well because it does allow her to kind of blend in, but she's always really aware of the things that separate her from other people at the school. You know, she talks a lot about even like in the dormitories, you can tell which students are on scholarship because of their bedspreads. That the students who are from wealthier families tend to have, or at least the female students have floral bedspreads, where even in her first year, she had like kind of like a double-sided, solid colored comforter that she had, and she realized like, oh, this is something that will set me apart. And so she made sure that the next year when she went back for grade 10, she had a floral bedspread because it helped her blend in a bit more. And it's also in how the students are spending their weekends and breaks, because you know she lives quite far away from her family, and because her family is not super wealthy, she's not just going home on holiday weekends, she's staying at the school. And later on in the book, she does end up having a friend that she becomes very close to, and she spends a lot of time with that friend's family. But there's a, you know, she's staying at the school, and then she's hearing about all of her classmates going on ski trips and, you know, learning about where they're spending their summers. And there are like all of these little details that she's constantly pinging on all the time, that she's seeing the differences. She's seeing what sets her apart. And I would say that she struggles with it internally, if not in an exterior way. Like I think she's talented enough at kind of blending into her surroundings, that she doesn't kind of run that risk of like setting herself too much apart. And for the students who do, for the other kind of maybe scholarship students or students that are kind of from relatively similar backgrounds or situations as her, like some of those students don't make it. And she does. So
I'm curious about how she ends up at this school, because it's funny you referenced about how like in Disney movies they sort of end up in these environments
yeah.
because of some like tragedy or something like that. But so how does it come to be that this girl is living in this prep school environment?
So it's interesting, and I didn't mark this as a passage to read, but she really kind of sought it out on her own. I think again, even as like a young person who was in like middle school, she looked at her high school and saw how kind of like blasé it was. And she, I think, was a good enough student where she could be somewhat competitive. Like she was one of the top students in her school. And so she took it upon herself to research and apply to alt school as well as several other private schools, because I think she had this idea in her head of wanting to have this special experience. And she talks about how a lot of it had to do with like the boys that were in the high school at her local high school, and how they were all kind of like long, greasy haired, wearing band t shirts, and even just sending away for the brochures for these private schools, the images that were attached to these brochures of like, you know, co-eds sitting in their, sweaters, their fall sweaters, sitting under a tree with beautiful foliage, like studying together. And she was just like, this is the kind of place I could have this magical experience. I could fall in love with someone interesting. And she kind of like had this idea in her head of what she could do. And she applied, she ended up getting in. Her parents were kind of like, oh, that's wonderful, but we can't afford this. And then lo and behold, she was able to get a scholarship that covered like 3/4 of her tuition. And so her parents looked at this as like an opportunity for her to get ahead and maybe have a better job and have a better income. And they went for it. And then as you're meeting her in her first year of school, there's a lot of kind of trepidation where she's like, oh, I actually did this, like I'm here now, I have to experience this, and this may not be this may not be what I wanted it to be and what I thought it was going to be, which often, our expectations and reality don't always match up, and that is certainly the case for her.
Right. So how does it, I mean, obviously, like you said, it's at a very formative moment in her life, but this is a pretty influential circumstance to put yourself in as well, like not only educationally, but socially, all of these different factors. So is she there for the full 4 years? And then what is that journey like? Like, how is the version of her that comes out in grade 12 at graduation impacted and changed by those 4 years in that school?
So you really, I mean, she outwardly addresses it in the book of how there's a new version of herself. There's a person that she's becoming because of this experience and because she has had to try to fit in. And I feel like it is so apparent in there's a section, probably like say middle of the book, and it's in her grade 11 junior year of school. And the first 2 years, they have a parents' weekend that it's every fall. It's in like late October. Parents will come and they kind of spend the weekend at the school, and they get to see where you're living. They get to meet some of your teachers. There's certain special events. I'm sure it ends up being probably like some sort of a fundraising event as well. But the first 2 years that she's at the school, her parents don't come. They can't afford to. Her brother, she has two brothers that are at home and they can't come. And so she just kind of skirts on by and is kind of cool with it. Like it's kind of cool with them not coming and being there. But her junior year, her parents drive out. So it's like an 18-hour drive to get to the school, and they come for parent weekend. And it's a bit of a disaster. Like it's one of those experiences reading it where you're like kind of cringing for her, cringing at her, cringing for her, and you can just see like the train wreck coming of this kind of building tension throughout the course of this weekend and this experience of having her parents come to the school. And I have a couple excerpts that I want to read. And this is her thinking about the fact that her parents are about to come, and really kind of trying to process that and prepare herself in a way. So I'll begin. Not that I didn't enjoy spending time with my parents, but wasn't I finally becoming comfortable at Alt? Weren't dinners like this evidence of my increasing sense that I belonged? I had entered the dining hall alone, and then, even though Nick had been there, I'd participated in the conversation, eaten spaghetti. My entire first year at Alt, I hadn't dared eat noodles in public. And weren't those signs of progress? It struck me suddenly that my parents might be bewildered by me, the alt version of me, for whom it was a daring act to eat spaghetti. In sixth grade in South Bend, I'd won first place in a pie eating contest at my elementary school carnival. I'd scarfed down the pie using no hands, collected a gold plastic trophy shaped like a vase with handles, thrown up in a trash can, and proceeded directly to the U turn, a ride on which my friend Kelly Robard and I sat in a cage compartment that spun and flipped. But I had changed since then. I was different. And no matter what my parents might think, this, my alt self, was now my real self. Outside, it was dark and cool. The stars were bright white, and the almost full moon was gleaming. The next 2 days were supposed to be perfect late October weather, sunny but not hot, and all over campus the leaves had turned gold and red. For the last 2 years, the weather had been similarly ideal for Parents' Weekend, which was unsurprising. Alt often seemed to me like a person who always got what he wanted. And I didn't resent this institutional good fortune. On the contrary, I felt grateful to be a citizen of it. Though I personally did not always get what I wanted, I was still part of Alt's universe of privilege. I spoke its language now. I knew its secret handshake. My sense of belonging had perhaps never been as acute as on this evening, and I don't know if I recognized it then. Later, it was obvious. But surely the timing was no coincidence. It was because my parents were coming and because I knew they would not belong.
Worlds colliding.
So, yeah. And yeah, and like I said, you're reading it and you're just like, oh God, this is not going to end well. Like, and you're almost like, oh Lee, like just be a little nicer, because she's on edge for the entire time that they're there. Any kind of social interaction she has with other classmates, and God forbid their parents, even the hotel that she told them to stay at versus the hotel that all the parents stay at, like it was just like one thing after the other, and it ends up, and I don't want to give it away, this 20-year-old book, I don't want to give away what happens in it, but it doesn't go well, and it's a really bad ending for this Parents' Weekend. But and I think I mentioned this to you in our preparation for this episode. We have a shared love of the Rachel incident, which we talked about last year on the podcast. And one of the things I really appreciated about that was it was her looking back. It was, and at her youth and this experience. And again, with Lee, it's the same feeling that I got. And you think about the age when, a student like this would be in a prep, like again, like ages like 13, 14 to 18, like everything is so big to you. Everything is so formative. It is where you do like get a lot of formation of your eventual identity starts happening. You become closer to your adult self by the experiences that you're having, and especially in a situation like that where you're completely immersed in an environment.
And while I am certain that the character Lee is not Curtis Sittenfeld, it's hard to not acknowledge the fact that Curtis Sittenfeld did go to a prep school, which she has admitted herself resembles Alt in many ways. And I can't help, as someone who hasn't read it, but listening to you talk about it and how Lee is reflecting on that experience. And like you said, kind of reconciling the choice to be there and their attendance at that school, which, by default removed them from their more domestic family, circumstances as well. Is there something to it that this is also Curtis Sittenfeld's way of reflecting and reconciling their decision to go through this experience?
Yeah. You and I both, I mean, we both have kind of listened to some, podcasts and looked at reviews. Cause of course, I'm always obsessively looking for reviews after I've read something, cause I always want to like confirm what I felt. Or get mad at like somebody that disagreed and is maybe insulting the lack of plot in something I really love. But so there was a really great BBC interview, which actually happened like not that long ago. I think it was when romantic comedy was released, but it was, looking at this book, because this was her first book. It was written in 2005, and she was, I think, 24 when she wrote it, which I'm like, wow, that's so young. And even to be able to have the amount of, I guess, I don't know, maturity to be able to look back and reflect on an experience like that at the age 24, because like I think about myself as like a 43-year-old and looking at myself at age 24, and there's like a real big canyon between those two people, and the maturity level and the ability to kind of reminisce and reconcile who I was and who I am. But yeah, she kind of says, yeah, this wasn't biographical, but I am from the Midwest, and I did attend a private school in New England. And I do think that something like this would have been a really great exercise in reconciling what that experience meant and what it felt like, and who you were when you went in, who you were when you left, who you are now, how it continues to shape you as a person. And I really love that actually about it. And one thing I do want to say is one of the reasons why I went directly to this book as opposed to reading any of her other books or even the other short story collection is because I had read Show Don't Tell, which just came out, as you said. And one of the short stories in that book is about Lee Fiora many years, like 30 years after her graduation.
Oh, I
And
love
so
that.
yeah. So I, of course, like I kind of got like little spoilers because like, but I had no idea what they meant. I didn't know who any characters were because I was just reading this little short story. But I really enjoyed that short story. And I thought, oh, her first book is actually that character, but it's a whole novel. And I was like, I want to read that. And I'm so glad that I did, because then even I want to go back and actually read that short story again, because I feel like I'll have an even better appreciation. I liked it to begin with, but I will have an even better appreciation because, like, maybe she's still reconciling, what that
Yeah.
experience is like. But now reconciling it as a middle-aged woman as opposed to a young woman. So yeah.
I'd love, and this might happen as part of your like rereading of that story, but even just now thinking back, like, can you comment on even stylistic growth, or like obviously as a writer, 20 years is a long time. Could you still hear some of the same voice, or do you think, how has her writing progressed, changed, evolved from, a 24-year-old writing prep to a however old she is now? I should be able to do some kind of math here, but I won't. Writing that collection of short stories that just came out.
So I would say she's probably like late 40s, maybe early 50s at this point. But I think what I appreciate, and really, I've I love it. And we kind of talked about this earlier. You mentioned it, the idea of finding an author and then just realizing that they have this whole like breadth of like books and items that then you can kind of interact with and absorb, and like how exciting that is when you find somebody who you really like their style. And what I find interesting, because I'm kind of reading things a little bit backwards, but reading Show Don't Tell, it really deals a lot with middle-aged women. I do think that she truly puts a lot of herself, or a lot of the people that she sees and are around her or she's encountered, into her writing. Because of course I'm middle-aged, woohoo for me. But it really, that collection of short stories really spoke to me, because as a middle class white woman who is middle aged, um, I was like, okay, yeah, I get this, and I appreciated it. And then kind of going backwards and then being able to kind of relate to some of the experiences, but seeing the difference and seeing the I guess the maturity, or the things that you focus on, or the things that seem to matter to you when you're young are younger versus what matters to you, or the things that surface as you go into like the middle age time of your life. You can see the differences. And then oddly enough, then reading this one, which was written in 2018, so like really kind of more like that like early 30s kind of person, I could see the difference in those short stories and the preoccupations of those stories. So really fascinating. So that's why, like, I think like it's been such an interesting experience to be able to read books set in different time periods of a woman who is not that unlike me
Mm.
and who I can relate to in a lot of ways, and seeing like their interpretation of these ages and stages of life, because they are distinct from one another, and mostly just in terms of like what the topics are and what the characters are really ruminating on. Because I would say a hallmark of her storytelling is that everything is really internal. There's a lot of like neuroses and like, you know, characters kind of like torturing themselves emotionally and mentally, which I mean, again, my bread and butter, totally up my alley. So,
I have to say, like, having only read romantic comedy, I feel like we are talking about a totally different person. Like, it's kind of interesting to me that we are talking about the same author because, and I actually don't mean this as a criticism, I mean this as an observation. Romantic comedy read to me like 30 Rock or SNL fan fiction. Like it was
mhm.
so just trying to replicate that world in like uncanny ways that I think were deliberately on the nose, like for fans.
Mhm.
To think that that person also was able to kind of dig as deep as what you're describing is really interesting to me. But I'm wondering if the same way that we talk about like the palate cleanser reading, it's like you read something super heavy and then you're like, oh, just give me like some Emily Henry for like, just a little bit of a
Yeah.
break. I wonder if that's her style for writing is like, I'm going to pour myself into this really self-reflective, complex, emotional writing. And then I'm going to write like something that's funny and it's set in an environment where there's comedy being written and romance. And is that like kind of therapeutic and restorative even for her to then move into like a deeper project right after that?
Yeah, I think you're onto something there. And I also think, I mean, this is someone who is like, really interested in the craft of writing and writing different types of stories. I mean, the fact that she's got short story collections, she's got novels, and the different styles, because I mean, she's got two different stories that are written like fictionalized versions of two, I guess, first ladies. One, as you mentioned before, Hillary Rodham Clinton, which is Rodham, and then The American Wife or An American Wife is based on Laura Bush. And so, like, almost like in a weird way, like, I don't know if you'd call that historical fiction. I don't know what you would call it, but, and then like the idea of romantic comedy. And, you know, I had heard of romantic comedy, didn't really think anything about it and wasn't necessarily drawn to it. And like, I really only picked up Show Don't Tell because it was like, once again, on the library bookshelf of like new releases. And I was like, hey, that looks kind of cool. I'm gonna check it out. And then like as soon as I got it, I was like, oh wow, like I really love her writing. And then when I was kind of reading the blurb on romantic comedy, I was like, I don't really think I'm going to read that. I mean, maybe I will eventually just to see it. And that's why I ended up going to prep, because I knew that there was that character that had been revisited in that collection. And so I really hope that you do read her one of or both of the short story collections, because I want to get your ideas, especially as someone who read romantic comedy and that was your first encounter with
Mm.
her and your first impression of her. And that's one of the reasons why I'm talking about prep as opposed to talking about Show Don't Tell, because I'm hoping that maybe at some point it's a shared read of ours that maybe we can revisit together and talk about a little bit more, because I think there's some like really juicy topics that get explored in those short stories. So
Yes, I fully intend to read it. I promise you that. It is my promise to you. So, as we've talked about the range of this author and, the spectrum of literature that they have produced, I do want to rein us in and talk
mhm.
only about prep as I ask you, in your opinion, is Prep by Curtis Sittenfeld a could read, a should read, or a must read?
Okay, this is always the question, Melissa. So I'm calling it a should read, a solid should read. And I'm only saying that, I mean, for me, it was a must read. I really, really enjoyed it. It spoke to me. But then, kind of going back to way in the beginning of this episode and our conversations about mood reads and vibes and plot or lack thereof, I do feel like for a person who does really dig a plot, this would be more of a should read, because I think they should read it. You should read it. If you've ever had any interest in the experience of being a young girl in the formative time of her life in an environment that is not her own, and all of the emotions and hormones and social issues that kind of come with that, it's an interesting read. Like, it's well written. She's a very good writer, but I don't think it would be a must read for those people. For me, it was a must read, but I think for, like, if I'm looking at a general audience, I'm saying a should read. So
I love
that's
it.
my
Well, I appreciate your candor and your consideration for the listenership of this show, to appreciate the diversity and spectrum of those who listen to the show, to recognize that this is not a, one size fits all recommendation, but it does sound like a really cool book. And I think, I'm excited to expose myself to more Curtis Sittenfeld stuff based on our sudden and unexpected Curtis Sittenfeld shared kick this winter. So thank you so much for this call. Thank you for also wearing denim with me today. I think we're both rocking it, and I look forward to seeing you again soon.
excellent. Bye.
Bye.